Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Let me introduce to you Professor Christian Schade from Humboldt University Berlin, who is an expert in decision-making and quantum mechanics. Christian, you have published a book with the title Free Will and Consciousness in the Multiverse, Physics, Philosophy, and Quantum Decision-Making with Springer, right?
Yeah, that is correct. I published that book 1.5 years ago, yes.
Oh, okay. And this following talk is based on your book, right?
That's also correct, yes. It's mainly or largely based on the book.
Okay. So originally, Christian, you were planning to give a presentation on your book on the Science of Consciousness Conference 2020, first in Arizona, then online, as everybody knows currently. So where you have been accepted within a concurrent session, which only allows you a slot for 20 minutes, right?
Yes, normally this upcoming online conference in September would have had me with a recorded 20-minute, pre-recorded 20-minute slot, and I thought that this is far too short for the stuff I have to deal with here.
Okay, but guys, that gives us the opportunity to listen to Christian's longer talk for free now. So enjoy, everybody, and now, Christian, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, and indeed, the presentation I'm going to do now is also on a slightly broader topic than the one announced at the TSC. And so I took the freedom to actually do a longer and more complete talk. And I personally think that everyone who's going to listen to it will benefit from this. And I'm quickly going to start here and share the screen with you. And yes, so that tells the expert that I'm recording with Zoom here. All right, so that is the title page of my book. As already said, the title is Free Will and Consciousness in the Multiverse, and it's published with Springer. And I just wanted to show this quickly. All right. So the title of my today's talk is An Alternative to the Hameroff 2012 Concept of Free Will: Vectorial Choices in the Clustered Minds Multiverse. And another subtitle here, a talk that would have nicely complemented TSC 2020. So let me start with the adagio by Woody Allen, can we actually know the universe? My God, it's hard enough finding your way around in Chinatown. So for those of you who have been in New York City and in Chinatown, they probably agree. And you will let us see why knowing the universe is actually part of what I'm going to present. So the other question, or the other way to put the title could have been, why Schrödinger's cat is relevant for understanding the actions of consciousness. And as you can see here in the famous Schrödinger's cat experiment, there's some poisoning possibility for a cat, and given the setup of the experiment, the cat is dead and alive, and that situation is called a superposition. So depending on whether a certain subatomic process takes place, the acid here in that chamber is released or not. And since this is unclear, and both possibilities exist in the Schrödinger equation, it's unclear whether the cat is dead or alive. In fact, it's both. And that brings me directly to the issue of my talk. And I'm going to firstly give you the entire setup here and the entire talk in a nutshell, and then I'm going into the issues of Schrödinger's cat and quantum mechanics more deeply, and then I will talk about free will and consciousness. All right, so in a nutshell, The presentation is based on the multiverse interpretation of quantum mechanics, specifically the clustered minds multiverse. So that is what I've introduced in my book. Consciousness has the role of generating top-down decoherence. That is also something which I've introduced, and that is a new way of defining the role of consciousness. Top-down decoherence actually solves the preferred basis problem in physics, which is the potential existence of odd and crazy realities. In quantum mechanics, this is all possible. And the preferred basis problem has to do with how do we actually define the framework that we want to have for the reality we are perceiving and experiencing. And so, as we will see later, again, this has to do with an action of consciousness. So consciousness is actually responsible for solving that issue. Then top-down decoherence is responsible for the creation of decohering histories. So decohering histories is a idea by David Wallace, who's also a researcher interested in the multiverse interpretation of quantum mechanics. And this is basically basically the idea is that things happen along the road, even though I'm a bit hesitant to call this time. As you will see later, time is a difficult issue. But the stream of experiences that we will have as the basis also a top-down decoherence. And then consciousness implements under certain restrictions, so-called vectorial choices, puts different emphasis on different realities, and that is actually a partially free act. So the implementation of so-called vectorial choices is the way we are able to execute free will. You may call vectorial choices a novel concept of free will, and I'm going to define that. So again, we are looking into the clustered minds multiverse. We will deal with certain concepts such as top-down decoherence and vectorial choices, and at the end of the day, we will hopefully see why free will is an action that is possible within consciousness. Now, one big question here that many people have when they deal with quantum mechanics or when they hear about quantum mechanics is they hear about the measurement problem. They often hear about the interpretation problem of quantum mechanics, and people have a hard time understanding what this all means. First of all, why is there a measurement problem? What is that? And then second, why is there even an interpretation problem? So why do we have to interpret anything in physics? Isn't physics hard science with, given formulas? And, unlike the social sciences or the humanities, nothing should be interpreted there. There shouldn't even be a need to interpret anything. Well, that's exactly not the situation in quantum mechanics. And interestingly, there is a measurement and there is an interpretation problem. And that's something I'm quickly going to show because it's very, very important for the rest of the talk and for the theoretical development. So Schrödinger in 1926 postulates a wave equation. Yeah, so the Schrödinger equation. And this equation is linear. It's even deterministic, very important because many people think that quantum mechanics has to do with some random developments, and that is not necessarily true. The random developments might be a description that is necessary for certain reasons, but the underlying wave equation is actually deterministic. So let's try to see how we can reconcile that. And reconciliation is actually the big issue anyway in quantum mechanics, because this wave equation, the Schrödinger equation, implies a superposition. And a superposition mathematically contains all possible states of the system. We call it a state space. All states are present in a non-trivial way. They exist. The question, however, is that if we measure or simply look or experience something, it's a singular reality. So the question is, how could it be that there is a superposition mathematically well defined that contains all possible states of the system, and then we measure only one of it, or perceive or experience one of it? What we do with our eyes and brains and so on is kind of a measurement, if you will. May I ask
one question, Christian?
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt you, but is deterministic, does that mean the possibility of all implications, that the cat is dead and the cat is alive and the cat is ill and all that is in between? Is this the deterministic part on this?
Thank you very much for your question. The entire wave equation is deterministic. So all developments follow the wave equation. And indeed, they contain a dead cat and a living cat and a sick cat.
Yeah.
And exactly.
Okay.
And it all follows.
Yeah.
Yeah? Mm-hmm. And the fact that we have coupled it to a seeming random process of certain processes in the microstate of atoms is puzzling, because it seems to be as if, a radioactive process is a random process. Yeah. And the Schrödinger equation itself doesn't contain any random elements.
Okay, crazy.
And then there's an operation applied to the Schrödinger equation, as I will be explaining later. The Born rule, which takes the modulus squared amplitudes of the Schrödinger equation. And that is, as people interpret it, generating probabilities. But it's an action applied to the Schrödinger equation. It's very accurate in predictions, but nobody understands why it's possible.
Okay, thank you.
So the interpretation problem of quantum mechanics arises from the measurement problem. The measurement problem is basically the Schrödinger's cat problem that we just, discussed. How to solve the riddle in terms of an appropriate theoretical framework. So how can we reconcile a Schrödinger equation with all states and then the measurement or experience of one state? So the way the Schrödinger's cat problem is often explained is we open the box and then we see whether the cat is dead or alive, and then people say, well, that's pretty trivial. So what's the big deal with a cat being dead or alive? Well, the thing is that the cat should be dead and alive. And the question is, why do we only see one of the states when we open it? When we open the box. That's the issue here. And then people say, well, it's a random process. Yeah, so it's given by the nuclear process. And then the question is, why is it a random process? If we apply the Born rule to the Schrödinger equation, we get probabilities. No problem with that. But why do we get it? And that's something that brings us closer into the interpretation problem of quantum mechanics. And the riddle has been dealt with by many people that suggest different solutions. That is interesting. So we're still in physics, but we see different solutions. All right, so what are those solutions? So first of all, there's a Schrödinger equation, so-called quantum superpositions, as I already said, and so-called ensembles. The ensembles are following the standard interpretation. Some people also call it the Copenhagen interpretation. Some simply say we should call it the reduction postulate by von Neumann, because the Copenhagen interpretation was still a bit more subjective, and von Neumann put it in purely mathematical terms. The ensemble basically is, we have those probabilities by the Born rule, yeah, that's consistent with applying the von Neumann's reduction postulate. That basically means applying the Born rule. Alternatively, a more modern picture is we apply decoherence, including the calculation of the so-called reduced density matrix. Sorry to use mathematical lingo here, but for those who are knowledgeable in quantum mechanics, they should at least know what I'm talking about. And this reduced density matrix is kind of a step after the pure quantum correlations are calculated, and they generate the probabilities, and they generate the same probabilities as the Born rule. So the calculations you do within decoherence only in the last stage, when you calculate the reduced density matrix, then they generate those probabilities. Before that, it's completely an innocent treatment of quantum mechanics. So decoherence, that we call it decoherence 1, is completely innocent. We will later see that some people like C, for instance, suggest for conceptual questions to actually stop the calculations after decoherence 1. All right. Now, the result always is, when you take the Copenhagen interpretation, when you take the results of the reduction postulate, then you get an ensemble of measurement outcomes. So basically, you get a probability vector, and with certain probabilities, you get certain outcomes. Let me call them quasi-classical realities. So you get outcomes you would associate with a reality. The cat is, dead, for instance, with a certain probability. Yeah? The cat is still alive with a certain probability. That's an ensemble. This ensemble doesn't exist in quantum mechanics, really, at least not in the core of quantum mechanics, not in the Schrödinger equation. The ensemble exists when you apply a certain interpretation of quantum mechanics, and that is the reduction postulate / Copenhagen interpretation. Then you get that ensemble, right? So the singular reality we get when we open the box, because in reality we only see the cat either alive or dead, right? The singular reality is supposed to arise via a collapse of the wave function, that's how they call it, and in a stochastic manner. So the idea is that the wave function kind of collapses into one state. So we have the superposition, then it collapses. Nobody ever, explained how this will work cosmologically, collapsing wave functions. What's what's happening on the cosmic level? Well, then people would say, oh, quantum mechanics is only for the small, which is totally untrue. So that's clearly beyond my topic here, but quantum mechanics is not limited to the small. Yeah, so when you discuss with modern quantum mechanics proponents and experts, many would argue that quantum mechanics doesn't stop at any level. Now, when you see this as a cosmological equation, so Schrödinger equation, maybe, plus some other ingredients, de Witt equation and so on, is generating some nice picture also, on a cosmological level. But then you cannot make any sense of collapses. So why is why should the, the entire cosmos collapse at some point, or what's that? All right. So that interpretation seems to be good for practical purposes, but it's unclear whether the application of the Born rule or the calculation of a reduced density matrix are appropriate for fundamental questions. Right? Dieter C. is one who put this very strongly in part of his publications. So my thesis here, my general thesis is, and therefore we should take this interpretation problem super seriously. And also its solution super seriously. It's not like, okay, let's take some quantum mechanics and then we are all happy. No, my point here is, not only are the humanities and social sciences are informed by quantum mechanics, but the interpretations and modifications chosen matter. Or to put it a bit differently, the interpretation problem is not a problem of physics. It is a problem of those who want to understand the world outside physics using results from quantum mechanics. So if you look at humanities, if you look at social sciences, if you look at the free will problem, if you look at consciousness, the interpretation chosen is highly relevant. So it's not that we are allowed to stop with, Copenhagen because we are no experts. So let's take the standard interpretation, right? And then walk away with it. Well, that doesn't work. So the Copenhagen interpretation or the von Neumann reduction postulate assumes, as I said, a collapse of the wave equation as a quantum system undergoes measurement. And this is at odds with the otherwise linear development of that equation. Again, and cosmologically, it poses a problem. Now, David Merman is known for then saying, well, shut up and calculate. I mean, the Born rule and the reduced density matrix calculation within decoherence analysis generate wonderful predictions in terms of probabilities. That's wonderful for all practical physical applications. So shut up and calculate. Just do your job, and let's stop discussing all those issues about the interpretation problem and measurement problem. What is all that about? And let's just go on. On the other hand, already Albert Einstein was pretty unhappy with this stochastic element that was brought into quantum mechanics. The sentence that is very well known is, God doesn't play dice. So he was super unhappy with this idea that there is supposed to be some stochastic element in quantum mechanics. Another prominent interpretation, so let's move away now from the Copenhagen or the reduction postulate, is the Bohmian interpretation. Well, the Bohmian interpretation basically says, all right, so we have the wave equation, we have our superposition principle, and we do not believe in a stochastic selection, but we rather think that there are hidden variables behind the scene, or pilot wave for that matter, that is kind of guiding the selection of a reality. So it's kind of, we do not know what's happening based on the wave equation. So let's take a step back and look at it from above. But the question is, where's the above, and where are those hidden variables, and where is the pilot wave? Because nobody has ever seen them. So it brings in an additional element just for the sake of saving a singular reality, kind of. But nobody knows what are those hidden variables or what are those pilot waves. So I do think that Bohmian quantum mechanics is a very interesting part of theory and a very interesting exercise for that matter, but I do not think it's parsimonious. So if we apply Occam's razor and apply this to the Bohmian interpretation, then it's super clear that we are not in an easy state because we are bringing in additional elements, above the Schrödinger equation, and we don't even know how to measure them or how to get them or whether they are even there, right? Then another prominent approach, which is rather a modification than an interpretation. So here the quantum calculus is already modified, is objective reduction by Hameroff and Penrose. Then also bringing in consciousness, so objective reduction goes back to Penrose, and then the Hameroff and Penrose theory is the Ochoa theory, which is integrating consciousness, to be precise. And this has been criticized and defended over decades, at least that's my reading of it. And it's also used to justify free will by Hameroff in his article from 2012. We are going to come back to this later. So the focus here lies on the multiverse interpretation, assumed in several recent philosophical publications, dominant within quantum computing and in cosmology, especially in conjunction with general relativity, the de Witt equation from 1967 already. That is an interpretation that doesn't modify anything, also doesn't require any collapses, no third variables, nothing like that. It just takes the Schrödinger equation, period. That doesn't mean that for predictions as a pragmatic step, you still need the Born rule, but the interpretation of the Born rule is very different. It's the kind of relative frequencies within one reality path. This is difficult to explain here in the talk. I have a long explanation on this in my book, especially in chapters 2, 3, and 4. So if you're interested, you may want to have a look. So the most radical, but also most parsimonious interpretation of quantum mechanics is the quantum multiverse that has been suggested by Everett, Hugh Everett, in 1957, and that leaves the wave equation fully intact. Moreover, it opens, at least from my perspective and from the perspective of many others, it opens new possibilities for understanding reality, consciousness, free will, and so on. So the multiverse interpretation is often called the theory of the universal wave function because it just gets into a very simple argument, and that is take the Schrödinger equation, period. Don't add, don't subtract, don't modify, just take the Schrödinger equation. In fact, Schrödinger in the mid-50s in Ireland, or early 50s already, as far as I remember, interprets the superposition as a coexistence of different realities. So Schrödinger in his old years in Ireland is already a multiverser. So Schrödinger's cat in the mid-30s gives the flavor of this, I think, but still kind of keeps the picture of a singular reality. But then in the 50s, Schrödinger's already arguing that way. And in fact, Everett is referencing Schrödinger for this in his Ireland lectures. Schrödinger is quite explicit about it, and Everett is actually referencing that. Everett is calling his interpretation the relative state interpretation because different versions of the observer are entangled with different measurement outcomes, hence realities. Practically speaking, different versions of an observer see different realities. Huh? So if you assume you are observing some quantum process or simply life, different versions of yours will be experiencing different versions of reality. Yeah, that's the hardest sell on all this here, right? And that's something you may want to have to swallow if you accept the multiverse interpretation of quantum mechanics. And I'm going to deal with this in a minute. It seems a bit less tough than it seems at first sight. There are some issues and problems around that interpretation. For instance, the problem of probability, oddities such as the quantum suicide. None of them are, I think, substantial. Just as an example, quantum suicide is a typical argument by philosophers. So you commit suicide in one reality, but you are still alive in various others. So yeah, if you have different, versions of yourself in different realities, yes, quantum suicide is reality. The problem of probability we already discussed. There's various possibilities to solve the probability problem within the multiverse interpretation. I'm personally not super happy with any of them. Some are pretty sophisticated and super smart. For instance, David Deutsch and also Wallace bring in decision theory, actually a model that I'm very happy with. Otherwise, rational decision-making theory, and combine this with quantum mechanics and get the required probability vector. The problem is that people are not always rational, and then my question would be, what's happening with a Born rule? And typically the Born rule probabilities are pretty stable. And there are a few more questions you can ask. For instance, what is a probability in a multiverse? If everything happens, everything should have the probability p equal to 1. Everything is happening with 100% chance. That's another argument, not mine in this case, but by many others that criticize that approach. So my take on this is, just empirically very pragmatic. The Born rule is generating, as I already said, probabilities, along one reality path. And why it is doing that still requires more research. So the probability problem is not completely solved, I would argue. So a bigger problem here is that the multiverse interpretation still needs interpretation. That's an argument. It sounds a bit odd, right? It's an argument that has been made by a few researchers in the 80s, Albert and Lower, and that's from 1988, and that's an approach where they basically, compare some interpretations of the multiverse interpretation and show that they have very different consequences. Now, my first question would be, is the multiverse interpretation inflicting another narcissistic wound on mankind? So what is the narcissistic wound? So Sigmund Freud in 1917 said that there are a few narcissistic wounds. The first wound is the heliocentric perspective, brought up by Copernicus, Galilei, and Kepler, where people are basically thrown out of the center of the universe. So the world is not the center of the universe anymore, and nothing is really moving around the world with a special purpose, but it's rather the world moving around the sun, and the sun is also moving, which is a later perspective, and so on. The second wound inflicted on mankind according to Freud, originates with Darwin, who sees mankind, developing from the animal kingdom, and not some specifically created species, but kind of a random process. That's what Darwin assumes. Then the third wound is the detection of the power of the unconscious, or as Freud called it, we are not, even leading our house. So there's a lot, or consciousness, or conscious experience is not necessarily what generates our behavior. And is the multiplicity of versions of ours maybe the fourth wound? Some people may say yes, maybe it's the fourth wound, but I would argue that the wound is small if the plausible interpretation of the multiverse is chosen. And with the plausible interpretation, I mean an interpretation that is ontologically convincing, that is not irritating. And I'm going to show some features of that interpretation. And also, I would argue that this wound is overcompensated by the benefits of living in the multiverse. And if you follow me and the interpretation I'm going to suggest, this interpretation of the multiverse, the clustered minds multiverse, leads to an issue with materialism, and this issue is very positive. It basically means we are leaving a totally materialistic worldview that even some proponents of the multiverse interpretation suggest, and enter an idealist version of the world. And idealist means that our consciousness, that our mind actually play a role. And that discussion about the assumptions of the clustered minds multiverse already go back to Plato. The question is also whether it's free will friendly or unfriendly. I'm going to argue that if you choose a certain idealistic version of the multiverse, you're also able to justify free will. Is it an actual branching of the universe, or is it only subjective reality? I personally think that there's one wave equation with many subjective realities that are branching. So it's not that we generate different, physical, material universes, but it's that we generate different subjective streams of experiences. And then the question is whether we have a top-down or bottom-up decoherence. And many people also, again, multiverse proponents would argue that there's a bottom-up decoherence. So it's kind of the world organizes itself, or the physical part of the world organizes itself, and then consciousness is only passively attached to those realities. I personally do not think that this is a consistent picture of the world, and I have some, problems with it. And I personally think that the way to look at it, even though it's very hard to do this in detail here, is that decoherence starts in consciousness, that our consciousness picks certain realities and the developments that it's experiencing, just not a singular mind. So I'm not ending up in a solipsistic framework as for instance Minsky does, although he's not, you know, necessarily writing it that way. But if you look at his modeling, he's looking at a, you know, pretty lonely life, because people have perfect freedom, but they are alone. And the way I'm looking at it is that several minds meet to get joint experiences, and within that there's a certain amount of freedom of the individual, and we experience subjective realities, and the underlying concept is top-down decoherence from the mind to the world. Yes, sure, absolutely.
I'm asking if Sigmund Freud ever reached out for something like multiverse, because I mean, if subconscious or unconsciousness plays such a big role, then, well, somehow it's natural to think about something like multiverse, because there are so many possibilities we grab unconsciously. So this is my question, if he ever got in contact with the concept close to multiverse or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it would be super plausible to think that way, yeah. Right? First of all, because this fourth wound that was not reported by Freud, but by myself, is nicely, you know, following from all that. Yeah. And then because Freud's concept of the unconscious might be related to the concept of selection of reality. And I totally agree that this is a natural consequence. Mm-hmm. It's actually Minsky's idea, mm-hmm. to say that the unconscious has access to the entire quantum reality, mm-hmm. and then consciousness is kind of only experiencing parts of it. Mm-hmm. I personally take that idea from Minsky and totally buy it. Mm-hmm. I think it's a very, very good idea. Mm-hmm. And I personally think that Freud could have had that idea, especially since quantum mechanics was developed during his lifetime.
Right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I have not found, please, you know, if anyone listens and knows the ref, you know, just send it to me. Yeah. But I have not found any mentioning of that in Freud. I have found mentioning of quantum mechanics in Watzlawick and some other authors that I've also dealt with in my book. But Freud himself, at least I've not found anything like that.
Okay. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Now let me introduce the premises of the clustered minds. Multiverse here developed in chapters 4 and 8. By the way, there's some confusion with the dates already. I've, you know, sometimes said Schade 2018, now it says Schade 2019. The reason is that the book really appeared in January 2019, but the copyright is from December 2018. Sorry about that. I think you find it online probably 2018. All right, so the multiverse is based on the Schrödinger equation, as I said, and the superposition principle I'm interpreting as, you know, laying the ground for various subjective experiences. We have only one physical reality, however, different subjective realities are perceived separately in consciousness. We do have decoherent histories a la Wallace, but they are starting in consciousness, and that's why I'm calling it top-down decoherence. And this is actually an idea which is very close to Heisenberg's idea of the world. Werner Heisenberg, you know, one of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics. However, Heisenberg, first of all, differed in his some of his theoretical premises, but then, moreover, he was a believer in a singular reality. Therefore, he was closely connected to the Copenhagen interpretation, but he had this subjective idealist picture that I'm bringing into the multiverse interpretation now. So I'm kind of merging Heisenberg's idealism, with Everett's / Schrödinger's multiplicity of worlds, late Schrödinger's multiplicity of worlds idea. If you're interested, Heisenberg is, tracing this back to Fichte, German idealism. Interesting stuff. Okay. Then the third, no objective flow of time. That's very important. Times are special cases of other universes. I have to admit that the Schrödinger equation still contains time as a variable. I also do not think that this is a problem, but I do not think that this is the last word that can be said here. So if you look into some of the literature here, Lockwood already in 1991 argued that there might not be any objective flow of time. Then there's the so-called block universe view based on special relativity. So when you bring in the perspective of special relativity into quantum mechanics, then you get into an interesting worldview. The first who made others aware of that was Minkowski in 1908, who basically brought in time as another dimension, so that you had different times and different three-dimensional spaces, and time was not a flow variable anymore, but like a fourth, continuous dimension. Petkov, Vasily Petkov Veselin Petkov, sorry, in 2010 developed an extreme form, but an even extremer form of this block universe view was then very recently developed by Silberstein and al. In 2018. It's like a frozen universe where nothing happens because there's no time and so on. Then there's a very important phenomenon, which is the disappearance of time when combining quantum mechanics and general relativity. In the canonical view suggested by de Witt that I've already mentioned, and also Deutsch in 1997 in his kind of popular science, but also pretty deep book based on de Witt is arguing that way. Then Barber 1999, again based on de Witt, etc. They all, use the problem of time or the disappearance of time as the basis to argue that times are special cases of other universes, period, and that there's no objective flow of time. Then the fourth premise in the clustered minds multiverse is that free will is executed in the form of vectorial choices. I'm later showing the simple formula for that. Then that there are balanced distributions of individuals' consciousness within minds clusters, but that means in adjoining realities. So in the clustered minds multiverse, we try to avoid situations where some people have very high consciousness in the same realities, the others are all zombies, right? Because that's a very unappealing reality that has been discussed also by others. Many people have seen this as a major problem of the multiverse view, that you may end up, given certain additional assumptions in such zombie situations, In the clustered minds multiverse, you don't.
That's scary.
It's pretty scary, right?
Yeah,
yeah. And
that freaks me out. I mean, crazy.
Yeah, but that's not the case in the clustered minds multiverse. Here we kind of gather around certain realities, either with no consciousness, almost no consciousness. There's always some, very, very, very basic level. So almost zombie realities, or we all have some serious amount of consciousness there. And that is here in 5 and in 7, you can see that, and also in 8. Yeah, in 7, the very low consciousness situations are actively avoided. In 8, the imbalanced distribution of consciousness between different realities is possible, but again, we need a balanced distribution within minds clusters, right? And then last but not least, the preferred basis problem that I've also mentioned at the beginning, where some crazy realities and odd realities are excluded. This is also an action of consciousness, selecting quasi-classical realities. That also opens the door for an understanding of some psychological problems, right? Such as maybe rather schizophrenia is probably the psychosis, schizophrenia problems can be understood that way, because that means that that consciousness can select odd and crazy realities if it wants. That means moving to the edge of the consciousness cluster, right? To the minds cluster, right? That's the issue.
Maybe very capable people.
Maybe very capable people.
Yeah.
However, at the very edge of the consciousness cluster, and very threatened by, tough experiences they make.
Yes.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
That could be amazing for current and for future therapies and healing activities.
Yes.
Oh my God, that's a big field.
Yes, I think so. I agree. I think this is actually a big chance, I think, for further development of psychoanalytic and also, psychiatric theory.
Yeah.
And treatment.
Yeah. But unpopular.
Probably unpopular.
Yeah.
Probably unpopular. First of all, the researchers in those fields have to swallow the multiverse perspective.
Yeah.
Which is probably not an easy sell everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And then second, they may want to have a, let me call it, open mind to see seeming diseases just as very free actions of consciousness. As consciousness, freely choosing crazy interpretations of the wave equation.
Mm-hmm. Oh my God.
It's a new view.
Paradigm change.
It's a paradigm change.
In medicine and psychology.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Now I promised something in the beginning and also in my title, and that is that I'm dealing with Hameroff's theory of free will. Mm-hmm. And that I'm having a critical view on this theory of free will. And let me try to make that clear. So first of all, I agree with Hameroff on the fact that the Libet evidence has to be devalued or kind of dealt with. And what is the Libet evidence or Libet et al. Evidence? Also, in modern neurosciences, similar results are found, for instance, by Soon et al., 2008. Now, the evidence by Libet and Soon and others, also criticized, by the way, so some people also now criticize the experimental setup, although this is pretty difficult in the Soon et al. Stuff where they use brain scans. But nevertheless, Libet et al. Has been interpreted as showing that consciousness is running after the fact. So people do some, choices, for instance, choose for certain motor action, moving the arm, right or left or whatever. Clicking on something on the right hand or on the left hand side. And consciousness, reacts very late. Yeah. So the report on having made the decision at a certain point in time, and then if you measure the response, it's late. Now that means that free will cannot exist. That's how many people have interpreted it. If consciousness is after the fact, where's free will going to come from? I mean, maybe partially from the unconscious, but this is a concept which is actually not completely odd if you combine unconscious and conscious free will and so on. But it's something that people would normally not buy easily. And then the second thing is that Libet himself was really shocked by his and his co-authors' results. And he saw it that way and always tried to devalue the evidence himself. For instance, he said consciousness may still have a veto power because what he saw is that, first of all, there's the readiness potential, maybe then there's reported conscious choice, and then what the people really do might still be afterwards. So that's what he saw in some of his experiments. So consciousness could still veto to do left or right and so on. But vetoing is a very small, action of consciousness, and it's not exactly what we normally think of when we talk about free will. Also, people have criticized that argument by Libet too, and it's a huge discussion. And again, in the Soon et al. Stuff in the neurosciences, they can even predict whether you go right or left based on the brain scan, because different regions are lit when you do left or right, which then clearly outrules Libet's idea of vetoing, because then it means that you actually know from the brain scan whether somebody's doing left or right. Anyway, my view on this is that a major prerequisite for free will is that we have no objective flow of time, so that times are special cases of other universes. That, I think, is the only way of dealing with that problem. So kind of consciousness is able to, influence backwards, whatever that means in a timeless universe, right? What people do. And Hameroff has the same idea. So I'm not alone with that, right? So Hameroff and I share that idea. My argument is that in the 2012 paper by Hameroff, he uses a physical framework that doesn't allow for that action. And the reason is that in any singular universe theory, I would argue, and again, this is much better, appreciable if you look into my book, in that part and also in other parts of the book. If you have a singular universe view, you do engage in some flow of time. Indeed, some people see this as a big achievement of singular universe theory and collapse theories, that they produce an objective time arrow. Yeah? Because if you have a collapse, you have a time arrow. collapse, and so on. Now, the issue is that if you have such a collapse and if you have such a time arrow, consciousness cannot influence anything backwards. And that is a very simple version of the argument I would make against Hameroff's approach. I do buy into his, or I do share his idea of some backwards influence of consciousness. I simply said, let me repeat that in a singular universe, and Hameroff and Penrose's or theory ends up in a singular universe. In a singular universe, you cannot do those backwards, whatever that means, influences. Hameroff's argument is that acausal information will be sent backwards, and therefore no paradoxes will materialize. That's something I'm very skeptical with, because I think that all paradoxes connected to time backwards effects stay relevant. Either the backwards directed information does change something or doesn't, where in the latter case it's simply irrelevant, and then we're back to zero. So my personal view is that the basic idea I share with Hameroff is consciousness is working backwards, but I do think you need the multiverse and parallel times to implement that idea. And it doesn't work in a singular universe, no matter it's whether it's Copenhagen reduction postulate or whatever.
Christian, one more question. If we go with Hameroff, that would mean that the world or the universe expands on and on, right?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I personally think that whenever you engage in a collapse theory, whatever kind, I mean, they have objective collapses based on some bringing in of gravity. And I personally think that for me, it's hard to see how it would play out on the cosmological level in any consistent way.
Yeah.
Because if many different entities, individuals, brains, all have the potential to collapse, how will this be coordinated?
That's chaotic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I personally, maybe I'm naive here, but I personally see this big coordination problem unsolved.
Yeah, maybe it's God.
Yeah, but then you are bringing back a singular reality imposed by God through the back door.
Yeah, right. Sorry.
And not by the Schrödinger equation.
Yeah. Sorry.
By the way, this is actually something that Squares has discussed in the 80s and early 90s, because he also dealt with the multiverse interpretation, and he wanted to understand how this coordination works. Exactly the question I was just bringing up, and then he was also saying maybe there's some universal consciousness / God bringing that coordination into the sphere. But it also means that there's not much freedom, because whenever anything is coordinated, the others, actions are not relevant anymore. It's a difficult matter.
Yeah, it's a huge question.
Maybe the first guy plus God, and then God implements, and I don't know.
Yeah, maybe he's working in IT.
Yeah, perhaps. Anyway, I personally think that the multiverse in this regard is totally democratic, and the only thing is, if we are super crazy, we are moving to the edge of a consciousness cluster, and our freedom is, kind of limited if we want to stay with no zombie realities, right? But it's only limited a bit. So we are still, making free choices, just that we have to coordinate somehow also on how we see the world. And then as long as we stay in certain minds clusters, we may not even have to become crazy to be free. Right. Let me just, All right, so this is my vectorial choice introduction here now. All right. Very simple. Vectorial decision, VD. The outcome of some vectorial decision is described via a vector. The components of the vector here, A1, A2, and so on, AI, up to AN, they give the amounts of consciousness allocated to the respective realities. So A1 stands for a certain reality, perceived in consciousness. A2, as we know, there's a top-down decoherence involved, there's a selection of quasi-classical realities involved, and so on. Right? And then the set of reality that still remains, so it's always a multiple universe or multiverse, right? And those realities that remain get different amounts of consciousness allocated to them. That's the idea here. Each component AI describes the amount of consciousness allocated to a specific reality or the emphasis, awareness this reality receives. It's kind of an awareness formula, if you will. And the number of components is arbitrarily large and equals the number of subjective realities concerned, N. The weights put on different realities must add up to 1. So I define that there's no infinite consciousness by an individual, right? There's a certain amount of consciousness and we can distribute that, right? We can put a lot of awareness on some realities and only very few on others and so on. But we cannot, be maximal on all, right? So there's a certain limit. Several restriction, conscious and unconscious, are within the individual, and they have to be taken into account when determining those weights. I'm having a quick view on that, but this really took me busy in the book for a longer time to actually explicate that, and here I can only give you a flavor of this. And then there are a few more restrictions by the conditions given in the minds clusters. We just discussed that, right? And it's like a parallel watching of different movies, but with different levels of awareness. So think of several screens, right? And then you look at this screen, which is a super nice movie, and also that screen, which is a bit scary, but super challenging. And the other screens are not so important. So that's kind of the stuff you do. And the potential reallocations of consciousness not considered within this presentation have to be taken into account too. And at this point, one may have to discuss something I've called quantum brainwash. So if people ex post allocate more consciousness into certain realities and less into those they originally had a lot of emphasis on and so on, you may actually change memory. I call it quantum brainwash, but maybe there's better ways of calling it. It's at least how I call it. A very simple, and pardon me, as a German university professor, that I use an example with cars, even though cars may not be the most important part of the world. The life choices that are concerned in this formula may not always correspond with the choice of cars. But let me at least do this here to clarify. So here we have a very simple decision by Louise. And Louise has only 3 cars that she is choosing from. So we only have 3 realities. Louise living with car number 1, Louise living with car number 2, Louise living with car number 3. Very simplified, right? This is buying a Tesla, this is buying a Skoda, and this is buying a BMW. Now let's assume Louise is a big fan of Skoda, and which is a Czechoslovakian car in the Volkswagen conglomerate. So here we have a large weight, so 70% of her consciousness, if you will, is put to that reality. You know, there's still some fair amount with BMW, and the Tesla in this case is not so, you know, she doesn't like that so much. And therefore, pardon me, I mean, Teslas are great cars. It's just, you know, just for the sake of the fun here. And the Tesla gets a bit less conscious emphasis here. Living with the Tesla, okay, right? That's what it is. Here, most conscious emphasis is put on the second reality, and that's what I wanted to show. That's an implication of this formula.
But Christian, does that mean that there are 3 versions? Louisa has 3 versions.
Yes.
One version is living with a Tesla.
Yes.
A very unconscious version. Then the most conscious version is living with a Skoda, and the middle consciousness with a BMW.
Exactly. There are 3 versions of Louise, and they are living with different cars. That's what it is.
And the conscious Louise, the most conscious Louise with a Skoda, doesn't know that she has versions with a Tesla and a BMW?
Yes, for sure.
Uh-huh.
Because she experienced herself, I'm coming to that in a second, she experienced herself having chosen a Skoda and having opted against the BMW and against the Tesla.
Okay.
Whereas the Louise with the Tesla has also experienced herself making a decision, in this case in favor of a Tesla.
Yeah.
And doesn't know about the other versions and so on. Exactly, that's what it is. Very good question, thank you.
But sorry, I have to come back again. Maybe she needs a new car. All 3 Louises need a new car. And the Tesla Louise and the Skoda Louise, they decide to buy a Porsche, and the BMW Louise decides to buy a BMW again. Does that mean that Louisa Tesla and Louise Skoda now goes together with her consciousness? That means 1 + 7?
No.
Okay, sorry.
No. In the view of decohering histories, and also subjective histories are decohering histories, the Louise with the Skoda will experience a life completely different from the Louise with the Tesla. Not only because of the Skoda, but simply because other things may happen.
Okay, because of the life, it's not the time, but it's a life span, or?
Exactly, they will never merge again.
Oh, okay, I see.
The histories have decohered. Decohered means they have separated from each other.
Okay. Okay, but this was important to me. Sorry to interrupt you, but
no,
maybe some other people are asking.
The tricky business is not to have a delusion of consciousness, because then sub versions down the way may have only very few consciousness, and that's why the reallocations of consciousness and the quantum brainwash are so important. So it may be that later down the road, most of the consciousness of A1 and A3 is reallocated to the Skoda. All right. The Skoda reality. Yes. Okay. All right. So now how does such a decision work? And how is it experienced? Now that is very tricky, and I've only shown here one of the pictures I've used in the book, just for the sake of time. Although time doesn't exist, we still experience it, right? And if you're sitting here for 3 hours, that would not be optimal. Now, This is how I see how it works. It's a bit, coming as that's how I think how it works. In the book, it's compared with other possibilities, how you could see it and how it might be seen, and then I'm showing why this is the only way it could work. That's not the way I'm going to do it now. I'm only presenting it here as a result. So first of all, there are some preferences, right? Everyone has preferences. And for me, being from decision theory, this is the most obvious thing in the world. People have preferences. Then free will, as I already argued, is active in the differential awareness for realities in which different choices have been made. We have a deterministic universe. So in the Schrödinger equation, there is no room for changes in the sense of an actual decision changing what the Schrödinger equation does. The only thing we can do is choosing those realities in which certain choices have been made. So the choices are part, our experience of making choices is part of the Schrödinger equation. But the way we make the choices is that we choose those realities where the choices are those that we want to make. We are not choosing in a physical, changing manner. There are those movies containing choices, and we choose those movies where we like the choices. Very important. And then the choices that we experience are not the choices we make. The choices are how we allocate consciousness between different realities. And we, as version 75, maybe, experience a certain choice that we have made. But when we make that choice, the allocation has already been done. That doesn't mean we are not free. It's just in a deterministic but multiple possibility Schrödinger equations, that's the way how freedom works. Okay.
So we choose opportunities.
We choose realities containing choices that are made in those realities. Mm-hmm. So what we do is there's a reality where car A is owned and a reality where car B is owned. Here I have only two cars. And yeah, we end up in those realities. These are the alternative realities. But the way it works, I just explained, is not that we actually make a physical choice, right? That was, by the way, one of the arguments against free will always. Solved. Right? People always said free will is not possible because we cannot change in a deterministic universe the cause of the world. We don't have to. There are multiple causes of the world, and we allocate consciousness to them to a different extent. That's why the free will problem is addressed here. Okay, some practical considerations. Just that you see that freedom and free will is not, perfect in a sense that we can do what we want. We already have seen that the cluster matters and that some other things may matter. This is a list, again, much more explicit in the book, and I'm only, giving you the very quick version here. First of all, there are unconscious motives of the focal decision maker, preferences within the person but unknown to him or to her. It's even worse. We may not even experience the influence of the unconscious on what we choose. Then there are unknown motives of other decision makers that are sharing the reality with the focal decision maker. And since we are not allowed to go into a zombie reality, right? Because that is nothing that is ontologically sound. Yeah, so this is a very strange way of living and thinking of life. Therefore, from a philosophical perspective, such cases should be excluded and have been discussed in philosophy a lot. And the way I did it is introducing the clustered minds multiverse. That's the way I addressed the problem. But it means that there are restrictions by the closeness to the fringe of a consciousness cluster. So when the consciousness cluster slowly moves away from how we see the world, we have to be careful to follow it to a certain extent. Otherwise, we end up in the edges, and that's lonely. Very difficult and lonely, very lonely. Then there's an impact of other, including non-human factors. This is the classical view of macro probabilities. Again, what is a macro probability? Also discussed in the book, since I'm not a big fan of quantum probability, although we need them for predictive purposes, the macro world probabilities are also, I mean, given a deterministic universe, in a narrow sense, they do not exist, but we don't know much, right? Therefore, probabilities, macro world probabilities are used to describe our lack of knowledge, right? That's the way we deal with the fact that we don't know whether it will be raining or whether there will be hail or sunshine the next hour, right? Okay, so that's another impact we have to take into account. Then utility interdependencies between different versions of the focal decision maker. That is total research area that is new if the multiverse perspective is used. That means, given that there's a splitting of consciousness between different realities and allocation of different amounts of consciousness to different realities, there might, on a higher level, or even in the experience of a singular individual, there might be utility interdependencies. So, for instance, the unhappiness of Louisa with a BMW might be okay, is partially becoming, on a very unconscious level, it's very hypothetical here, right? Maybe part of the experience of the Louisa with a Schade or the Louisa with a Tesla. Not in any, quantitatively easily measurable sense. However, I would not exclude the fact that there are ways to measure such interdependencies. And I think they are pretty plausible. Think of the world as a, training and experiencing planet. And people do different routes to try out different things. And perhaps the overall utility of all those trials is generated by interdependencies. Then there are perhaps decisional conflicts with extreme alternatives. Very hard to explain. Larger splits of consciousness with versions of the focal decision maker would then be promoted. Let's say we have very extreme possibilities, such as an investment, which is super risky, but also potentially makes you rich. And then some investment, which is super safe, but not much will happen. And if you really push yourself into this trade-off and say one version of yourself goes for the risky stuff and one version goes for the other, then you have probably a very large split of consciousness, because they are hard to reconcile those alternatives, right? And last but not least, free will. That's the leftover, the residual, if all those others are walked through. So basically, free will is what remains when the unconscious motives, the unknown motives of other decision makers, the impact of others, including non-human factors, the utility interdependencies, and the decisional conflicts are taken into account. That also makes one thought by Freud very plausible from the beginning of the last century. For instance, the more you reveal your unconscious motives and the more you make it accessible to consciousness, the higher is your freedom. And that's exactly the kind of idea here. So let me end with some conclusions and future research. So I personally think that the clustered minds multiverse is a rich concept for understanding reality in an ontologically appealing way. The concept is fully consistent with quantum mechanics and a universal wave function. The concept does not inflict another narcissistic wound on mankind, I personally think, because the chances are much larger than the fact that there might be different versions of us. However, it requires to overcome materialism as the sole basis of science and philosophy. And I personally see this as a big, big plus, right? So it brings back mind and consciousness into the sphere. And consciousness not as a byproduct of the physical, but consciousness as, let me call it, a dualistic view, as something extra, something special. And indeed, the classification, now not dealt with much in this presentation here, the classification within the philosophy of mind that I've developed for my own approach is dualistic idealism. So that's a concept that's the way I've labeled the concept. So it's an idealistic view, but it's dualist because there's still a playing field, which is the wave function, and then there's consciousness playing on that field. So for those knowing a bit about Indian philosophy, it's kind of Maya with an explicitly modeled playing field. I've also called the concept, or I've labeled the concept, or I've put the label on it, weak psychophysical parallelism. So the psychophysical parallelism would claim that there should always be a correspondence between physics and what we experience. This is kept here. However, the weak means that some realities, some experiences only get a very small amount of consciousness and awareness, and some get a large amount. But there's none of them completely tuned out. And therefore, the psychophysical parallelism is kept, but in a mathematical way, we would call it a weak psychophysical parallelism. And last but not least, I personally think that experimental tests of the theory are possible. Some people would argue that within quantum mechanics, the multiverse and, for instance, the reduction postulate and so on, they all make the same predictions, therefore there is no possibility to do it right in the form of the test. There are some very modern approaches trying to generate different predictions with the multiverse interpretation and the reduction postulates very, very recently, like last couple of months. I personally do think that there are some very problematic derivations, mathematically problematic derivations made as seeming claims of the multiverse interpretations. I personally think it's not a comparison I think should be made based on those predictions, but that's my personal view. What I do think is that there are experiments possible that do discriminate between the different interpretations of quantum mechanics, but these are not purely physical, but psychophysical experiments. And exploring this in more detail is clearly beyond this presentation. Let me end here with that thought, just as food for thought. There might be possibilities to actually explore the differences in experimental work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian. That was really amazing. Maybe is there some time for questions?
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay. Please go ahead, whatever you want to know.
Because I would love to come back to the clustered minds multiverse you introduced in your book. And the question is, does this imply a new physics? And do we have to change quantum mechanics in the form we know it?
Yes, thank you so much for asking this. I admit that in the brevity of my presentation, it was very hard to make that point more explicit. No, it does not require any new physics. Indeed, I think that the big advantage of the clustered minds multiverse is that it is just based on the Schrödinger equation, that it does not need any additional assumptions, that it does not need any additional, maybe even modifications. It doesn't need any implants such as collapse of the wave equation. It just keeps the Schrödinger equation, it's intact. And the interpretation that is used and introduced in the clustered minds multiverse, I personally think also addresses some of the multiverse interpretations that have been proposed by others and have been critically seen by many. And that is, it kind of makes a smooth transition between minds clusters, edges of minds clusters, free will, people kind of coordinating on the level of the mind without such harsh consequences such as meeting zombies or stuff like that.
Okay. Quite interesting. Okay, thank you. And let me come back to free will. Does its existence require something as extravagant as the clustered minds multiverse?
Yeah, first of all, I would argue that the clustered minds multiverse is not as extravagant because it doesn't change the physics of the Schrödinger wave equation. That's one thing I would argue. So the extravagance that sometimes is claimed by people who discuss the multiverse concept is this: there are many worlds and many versions, and this is kind of extravagant. But this kind of extravagance is just the superposition principle of the wave equation and nothing else. So I don't think it's as extravagant. And yes, I do think it is necessary to justify free will, because I personally think that all singular universe versions of free will either run into the big determinism trap. So if you do not use quantum mechanics, but say a Newtonian worldview, where is the free will supposed to come in and play out? And if you use quantum mechanics and go that route of a singular universe quantum mechanics interpretation, then you kind of bring in some time arrow via the collapses. And when you have a time arrow, consciousness cannot go backwards. If it cannot go backwards, you cannot solve the limit evidence. I personally think it's really only possible in the multiverse. Okay. So free will, I personally think, found the theoretical friend in the multiverse.
Yeah. So it's not possible in a singular universe.
No, I don't think it's possible.
Okay, your statement. Thank you. And then, as you name it, top-down decoherence. I'm asking myself, isn't this not the idea somehow that the physics we experience starts in consciousness and then does not even imply a singular, well-defined reality?
Yes, You're totally right with what you are saying. It's just something we have to accept when we accept an idealist version of the multiverse. The materialist version of the multiverse, the versions that are proposed by the so-called Oxford School, including Saunders, Wallace, and so on. I would personally argue they always need to assume that decoherence is possible out of nothing. And they do simulations on this, computer simulations, and they always end up having too many realities, also too many odd and crazy realities. And then they kind of bring in some, whatever selection, but in a way that I personally think is not quite clear how the selection is supposed to be made. So those simulations are not really doing the trick, I think. I mean, it's my personal view. And on the other hand, the top-down decoherence is super parsimonious. You just have consciousness, and consciousness is selecting the preferred basis. So how the reality, the quasi-classical reality, is supposed to look like. And then also creates the decohering histories that you are going to experience, and then also, allocates consciousness between the different versions of reality and versions of yours. So I personally think that it's the best solution for the problem.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful questions. Do you have any more questions?
Well, a few, yes, but I think that would take too much time now. Thank you, Christian, for this inspiring talk and for answering my questions. I think it was only 3 questions. I would have more, but maybe later on. So is it okay for you that people get in contact with you for their further questions?
Yes, absolutely. And let me just, I forgot to show that. So we were doing Q&A without me showing Q&A, but that's probably not a big thing. But here's my contact information. So, so whenever you have listened to this talk and have any questions, just contact me here on that email, using that email cds@hu-berlin.de. So that's Humboldt-Universität, cds@hu-berlin.de. So I would be happy if you send me some emails, and absolutely I'm going to answer your questions.
Okay, so again, thank you very much, Christian. And thank you guys for listening to Christian. I hope you enjoyed this talk as much as I did. Well, take care and have a good and inspiring time, everybody.
Yes, and thank you for listening. And I personally think it was, for me, also a pleasure. And I hope that I hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.